The slurry hit him before he heard it coming. It came down warm, which was the worst part. Fermented protein paste from the recyclers, 3 days past edible, thick as engine grease and the color of a healing bruise. It sheeted over Daniel's hair, found the collar of his cadet blacks, and slid down the channel of his spine while 30 voices on the mess deck of the Ashen Vigil rose into a sound that no human throat could make. Laughter pitched high and glassy, like blades drawn slowly across a window. Stayed on his hands and knees, he closed his eyes, he counted. 1, 2, 3. Above him, Subcadet held the empty bucket at arm's length and let the last of it drip onto the back of the human's skull. Was tall and lean, with a ridged copper scalp, and the gold command bars on his sleeve that everyone on the ship knew his father had bought. He crouched with the easy grace his species had at 3/10 of a gravity, one long hand pressed flat on his head, holding him down like a pet being groomed. Look at it, said, and the ring of cadets leaned in. It doesn't even fight, 11 days and it just kneels. The mess deck was a long-ribbed cavern of alloy and cold blue strip lighting, and tonight it smelled of sour yeast and ozone. 6 species stood in the circle, with their smooth slate skin and enormous black eyes. A pair of pale with mouths full of needle teeth. Cadets, one bulbous-headed hunched near the back. Half of them had their comm slates out and raised, recording, the little red capture lights blinking like a field of dying stars. Could feel every one of them. He could feel the tray edge biting into his left palm, feel the slurry crawling into the corner of his mouth, thick and coppery and alive with the wrong kind of bacteria. He did not open his mouth. He did not open his eyes. He breathed through his nose in slow, measured pulls, the way his brother had taught him in the surf off Half Moon Bay when the water was trying to kill them both. 4, 5, 6. Careful, as someone drawled from the back, a grinning, you'll drown it. They breathe poison at home, said, it can handle a little soup. More laughter, sharper, tasted it along with the slurry. He had been on the Ashen Vigil for 11 days. He was the first human ever admitted to the Concordant Officer Academy, and every cadet on this deck knew exactly why. Earth had been granted 1 seat, 1 uniform, 1 chance. As a political courtesy to a species the Concordant Assembly still officially classified as provisional. Provisional meant unproven. Provisional meant the instructors could stand in the far doorway, arms folded, and watch a cadet be baptized in garbage without ever seeming to see it. Provisional meant that if he broke, if he ran, if he swung, the report would write itself, and it would not be a report about. So he did not swing. That was the thing none of them could understand, and could see it flickering across their faces even with his eyes shut because he had seen it every night for 11 nights. Confusion first, then contempt. They had expected him to rage. The stories they had grown up on painted humans as howling, feral things from a rock so violent it had been quarantined for 6 centuries. When he knelt instead, when he went still and quiet under their hands, they took it for cowardice, and cowardice made them bolder. His fingers tightened on his scalp. Say thank you. Opened his eyes. The floor beneath him was a mirror of black alloy, and in it he could see himself. Dark hair plastered flat, a smear of yellow-green across one cheek, jaw set so hard the muscles stood out like cable. He could see the whole ring of them reflected upside down behind him, a crown of pale, grinning faces. And he could see his own hands spread flat on the deck, fingers splayed. They were not shaking. Did not notice that, nobody noticed that. Thank you, said, his voice came out level, almost gentle. The mess deck erupted. A cadet slapped the wall. Someone whooped, straightened, delighted, and turned to face his audience with both arms spread like a performer taking a bow, and in the shift of bodies caught a glimpse of the 2 people on that deck who were not laughing. The first was a small and standing near the ration line with her slate held up like everyone else's. But her thumb was not on the record key. It was hovering. Her enormous black eyes were fixed on the human's hands, and something in her expression looked less like amusement and more like a person watching a shadow move at the bottom of deep water. The second was old. He stood in the aft doorway with a maintenance sled parked behind him, and quartermaster with a scalp gone dull green with age and a face like a dry riverbed. He was not looking at all. He was looking at, and his mouth was tight, and when the laughter thinned enough for words he spoke without raising his voice. That one's from Saul. A few heads turned, glanced back with a lazy smile. We know where it's from, quartermaster. Then you should read your own intake files, boy. The old's eyes moved to the wet floor, to the human still kneeling in it, and for a heartbeat something almost like pity crossed his face. Then he pushed the sled forward and was gone into the corridor. Laughed it off, most of the deck laughed with him, but had watched the girl's thumb finally settle, not on record, but on the key beside it, the one that pulled up a search field. 7, 8, 9. He pushed himself up. He did it slowly, deliberately, one hand and then the other, rising to his knees and then to his feet with slurry running off him in long ropes that slapped against the deck. He was not tall by human standards. On this ship among who stood two heads over him, he looked compact, almost stubby, and he knew that was another thing they mistook. They saw short and red weak. They saw a species that never grew long limbs and never wondered why. He stood there dripping and looked in the eyes for the first time in 11 days. Met the look, and for a fraction of a second his smile flickered, because whatever he had expected to find in that human face, it was not calm. Then the moment passed, his grin came back wider than before. "Something to say?" he asked. "A towel," said, "if there's one going." It landed like a punchline. The whole deck howled. It actually doubled over, turned in a slow circle, arms out, soaking it in, and one of his friends slid a second bucket across the wet floor toward him with the toe of a boot. Watched it come. He watched bend and hook it up by the handle, watched the surface of the slurry slop and settle, and he thought about his mother standing at the departure gate on Earth with her hand pressed flat against the glass. Do not give them a reason, Danny. Whatever they do not be the reason they say we are animals. He thought about the file the old quartermaster had mentioned. He had read it himself once, sitting in an academy office on Luna. He knew what it said about his kind. He knew what it recommended. He knew that at any point in the last 11 days, he could have ended this. He had not. That was the choice. That was the whole of him. Lifted the bucket high, and the strip lights caught the rim and threw a cold blue ring across the ceiling. "Say it again," said softly. "Say thank you." The girl at the ration line had stopped filming entirely. Her slate was tilted toward her own face now, lit from below, and saw her lips part, saw her read something, saw the deep black of her eyes go wide and wider still. He closed his own eyes again. 10. The bucket came down. And this time, in the roar that followed, in the shriek and the slap and the stamping feet, nobody heard the girl whisper the two words that would matter more than anything else on that ship in the next 12 hours. "Oh no." The wash cell water came out at 40 degrees, and stood under it with his forehead against the wall and let it hurt. The slurry did not want to leave. It had set in his hair like resin, and he worked at it until the drain ran yellow, then clear. The cell was built for proportions, so the nozzle sat far above his head and the spray came down thin and scattered, less a shower than cold rain in a tall closet. He did not mind. Rain, he understood. He was 23, born on a planet the Concordant Assembly listed as Sol III, Class 9, quarantined. And every one of those words was something the cadets outside had been taught to fear before they could read. Class 9 meant surface gravity of a full standard G, more than 3 times what an skeleton was built to carry. It meant an atmosphere so saturated with oxygen that most concordant species would burn their lungs on it in a day. It meant a world where the weather itself was a predator, where the oceans rose up and swallowed towns, where the ground split and the sky threw fire and the largest land animals could crush it with a careless step. And it meant one more thing, the thing that had kept the quarantine in place for 6 centuries. Something had evolved there. Something had survived all of it and stood up and looked at the stars. Turned off the water and stood dripping in the dark. He had grown up in a town called, on a cliff above the Pacific, in a house that shook when the storms came in off the water. His father had fished. His mother had taught. His brother had been 6 years older and had joined the Coast Guard at 18 because he could not stand watching people drown from the shore. Had taught him to swim in water that wanted him dead, taught him to read a rip current by the color of the foam, taught him that panic was a choice, and that you made the other choice every time, no matter how badly your body screamed. Had gone into a January sea after a capsized trawler and had not come back. Had been 15, he stood on the cliff for 3 days. He pulled a towel from the rack, one of the thin ones that barely reached his waist, and scrubbed his hair until his scalp stung. Then he looked at his hands in the low blue light. Broad palms, thick fingers, knuckles like walnuts, ordinary human hands, and he had spent 11 days keeping them open and flat on the deck because he had made a promise at a departure gate to a woman who had already lost one son to a world that did not forgive. Do not be the reason they say we are animals. She had not meant it as an order, she had meant it as a prayer. Down the corridor and 2 decks up in the barracks, lay stretched across 3 bunks with a bottle of fermented root balanced on his chest, and told the story of the towel again. "A towel," he said, and the 6 cadets crowded around him howled on cue. "If there's one going, 11 days of drowning it in garbage and it asks for a towel." "It's broken," said his shadow, a lean with a chipped scalp ridge. "You've broken it." "I haven't broken anything, there was nothing to break. Drank and let the burn settle. That's what my father says about them. 6 centuries in quarantine, and the second the assembly cracks the door they send us this, their best and their best meals." He said it lightly, but something had sat wrong in his chest since the mess deck, and he could not name it. The human had looked at him, just once standing there dripping, and there had been nothing in that face at all. Not fear, not fury, just a kind of terrible patience like a rock face waiting for weather. He drank again to wash it out. Tomorrow, he said, we do something better than Buckets, who has access to the gravity bay. Grind's cousin runs the simulator maintenance cycle, she owes me. Good 0600 before the drill, we put the human in the bay and we bring the plates up to point 6. Spread his long fingers and press them slowly down onto his own chest, miming weight. Double what any of us can stand. Let's see if it still asks for a towel when its bones start to bend. Let's hear what it sounds like when it screams. Laughter, bottles clinking. Somebody started listing bets on how long the human would last. Nobody noticed the small sitting on the end bunk by the door, knees drawn up, slate held close against her chest. Her name was, she was the youngest cadet aboard, a hydroponics engineer's daughter, and she had been assigned to section on the first day and had learned within an hour that the safest thing it could do around was hold up a slate and be furniture. She had filmed the mess deck for 11 nights and never once pressed record. Tonight, for the first time, she had pressed something else. The intake file had been buried 3 menus deep in the ship's open cadet registry, right where the old quartermaster had said it would be, and it had taken her 4 minutes to find it and less than 1 to stop breathing. She looked at it again now while the others laughed. The slate's glow lit her enormous black eyes from beneath. Species Homo, origin, Sol III Class 9. Sustained gravity tolerance 1G nominal 3G short duration. Native atmosphere 21% O2 considered acutely toxic to thermal range, survivable from -40 to +50 without equipment. Endurance index highest recorded among sapient species. Unarmed strength ratio OSSARI baseline 6.4x. And below that, in the flat red text, the assembly reserved for hazard classifications. Recommendation: do not engage in unarmed contact. Read the last line 3 times. Then she looked across at, sprawled and laughing, and pictured his long hand pressed flat on the human's head, holding it down. She stood up. The bunk creaked, heads turned, glanced at her with the mild surprise of a man noticing a chair had spoken. Her voice came out thin. She held the slate out toward him with both hands. You need to see this before tomorrow, please. He looked at the slate, he looked at her, and he smiled, slow and generous the way he smiled at all small things. He said, "Are you afraid of the human? You should read the file." I've heard about the file. My father sits on the assembly. It's a fairy tale the Sol delegation wrote to make their pet sound frightening. He swung his legs off the bunk and rose to his full height, and the room went quiet the way it always did when he stood. Do you know what I see when I look at that thing? I see a species that took 600 years to build one ship. I see something that kneels in garbage and says thank you. That's you. The gravity bay, she said, if you turn the plates up and it doesn't hurt him. His hand moved. It was not a hard slap, not by standards, but it caught the slate cleanly and sent it spinning across the deck plates to fetch up against the far bulkhead with a crack. The room was very quiet. Furniture, said gently, doesn't talk. He sat back down. After a moment, the laughter started again, uncertain at first and then louder, and someone passed the bottle and stood alone in the middle of the barracks with her empty hands shaking at her sides. She went and picked up the slate. The screen had cracked in one corner, a white star spreading through the red text. The file was still open. She read the last line one more time and then quietly closed it and looked at the chronometer. 6 hours until the gravity bay opened. The overhead chime sounded, and every cadet went still because that particular 3-note tone was reserved for the captain's voice. All hands, full crew combat readiness drill has been advanced. Report to stations at 0500. Repeat, 0500, that is all. Looked at and grinned, even better, we'll have an audience. And in the wash cell 2 decks down, Daniel pulled on a clean uniform, sat on the edge of the bench, and pressed his open hands together between his knees until they were still. They came for him at 0540, 20 minutes before the drill, 9 of them in a loose, grinning wedge with at the point. Was already dressed and sitting on his bunk with his hands folded. He had not slept. He looked up when the hatch opened and read the whole plan in the shape of them, with a maintenance on a lanyard, 2 flanking, the trailing at the back with his slate already raised. Was there 2 at the very rear, small and silent, and she would not meet his eyes. Walk with us, said pleasantly, we want to show you something. He walked with them. The gravity bay was a cube of dark alloy at the heart of the training deck, 40 meters on a side, its floor a lattice of graviton plates that could simulate anything from a moon's whisper to the crushing pull of a gas giant's upper atmosphere. Keyed the hatch. The cadets filed in and spread along the walls with the eager restlessness of people at a fight. Walked to the center of the floor and stopped him with a hand on the shoulder. Stand here, he said, right here, don't move. Stood there. backed away toward the control alcove by the door and watched him go, and something in his chest that had been clenched for 11 days began very quietly to unclench. Not with anger, with a kind of grim recognition. He knew what this was going to be. He had known since the barracks. Point 6 called to slowly, let it feel every increment. The plates hummed, felt the floor take hold of his boots, felt his uniform settle heavier on his shoulders, felt his cheeks pull down a fraction and his shoulders drop. Point 4. Point 5. He heard the along the walls make small involuntary sounds as the field bled past the containment ring and brushed them, heard the hiss. Point 6. Stood in the middle of the bay and breathed. He did not scream, he did not stagger, he did not sway. It felt like walking uphill with a small child on his shoulders. It felt like any Tuesday. The laughter along the walls started, then thinned, then stopped, and in the silence that followed he heard say, "Higher," in a voice that had lost some of its music. And then the ship screamed. Not an alarm, a sound, a deep tectonic groan that came up through the plates into the soles of his boots as the entire Ashen Vigil lurched sideways under a blow like a hammer the size of a city. The strip lights died. Red emergency strobes stuttered on. Somewhere very close, metal tore with a shriek that went on and on. Then the real alarms began, all of them at once. Hull breach, training deck, boarding action in progress. This is not a drill. The bay hatch slammed shut behind with a pneumatic bang, and the emergency bulkheads dropped in the corridor beyond, and the graviton plates, damaged in the shock, made a rising electrical whine that climbed and would not stop. Felt the floor take hold of him harder. Point 7, point 8, point 9. Along the walls, the cadets went down like cut flowers. The folded first, ribs and hips collapsing sideways. The hit the deck with his slate skittering, clawed at the control panel, fingers spidering across dead glass, and then his knees buckled and he slid down the alcove wall. Tall and proud and gold-barred, tried to stay upright through sheer force of will, and watched his long legs bow, watched his spine curve, watched him go down onto all fours with a sound like a bag of sticks being crushed. 1.0. Full Earth gravity. Stood in the middle of the bay and breathed. He looked down at his hands. He looked at the cadets on the floor around him, 9 of them moaning, pinned, their long, fragile bones grinding under a weight they had never in their lives been built to carry. He looked at, curled by the hatch with her arms wrapped around her chest, black eyes huge and wet, and she was looking straight at him. She had read the file, she knew. The hatch began to glow. A ring of orange light traced itself around the seal, and then white, and molten alloy ran down the door in bright threads and hissed against the deck. Cutting torch, boarders, heard voices on the other side, harsh, clicking, unfamiliar. Not cadets. Raiders in the powered frames the pirate clans stole from Concordant supply lines, frames that let them walk in a full G and carry weapons that could vent a compartment in a heartbeat. Rasped from the floor. His face was pressed sideways against the plates. Blood ran from one nostril, thin and violet. His fingers scrabbled toward the rifle he had brought in on his shoulder, the one he had meant to lean on while he watched the humans suffer, and he could not lift it. He could not lift his own arm. It came out as a whisper. 9 cadets on the floor, and the only one who could stand was the one they had spent 11 nights on their knees. Cross the bay. He walked because at 1G a human walks, and to the cadets on the floor it must have looked like watching a mountain decide to move. He bent, picked up his rifle by the barrel, weighed it in his hand, and set it down again against the wall. He would not need it. He put his hands under his arms and dragged him 12 meters to the cover of a plate housing, one-handed, the way his brother used to haul him out of the surf, and made a thin, disbelieving sound the whole way. Then he turned around and faced the door. It fell inward with a clang. 2 raiders came through it shoulder to shoulder in black frames, shock batons crackling, and the first one saw a short, soft-skinned biped standing in an empty room and swung without slowing. The baton took across the chest with a crack of discharge and a smell of ozone. He did not fall. The raider's frame had time to register surprise, closed the distance in one step, seized the baton arm above the wrist with both hands, and twisted. Metal shrieked. Servos overloaded with a whine and a pop, and the raider's own frame wrenched its arm around backwards until something structural inside it broke. Drove his shoulder into the frame's chest, and it went over onto its back and did not get up. The second raider fired. The plasma bolt went wide, scorching a black star into the wall because it was already inside its guard. He hit it 3 times, low, center, high, and on the third the frame's faceplate cracked and the raider inside went limp and heavy and let it slide to the floor. The bay was quiet. 9 cadets lay on the plates and stared. Was crying without sound. His mouth was open. And propped against the housing where the human had dragged him, looked at Daniel standing over 2 broken frames with a burn across his chest and his hands open at his sides, and understood finally at 1 full standard gravity exactly what he had been pouring buckets on. Then the atmosphere alarms began. Compartment venting, oxygen AT 60%. Somewhere the raiders had cut a line. The air thinned, felt it as a slight tightening, a familiar cold in the lungs, nothing worse than a fast climb in the Sierras. Along the walls, the cadets began to gasp. 50%. Their lungs were built for thin, bright atmospheres, and their thin, bright bodies could not fight the plates for the breath they needed. His lips were turning, his black eyes were rolling. Went to the wall. He found the vent panel behind the control alcove, put his fingers into the seam and pulled. Alloy bent, bolts sheared. He tore the panel off its mounts and jammed it across the breach, then braced his shoulder against it and held it there while the hiss died to a whistle to nothing. Oxygen stabilizing. He turned back to the room, chest heaving, blood on his fingers, and there was, dragging herself toward the ruined hatch on her elbows, pointing. Beyond it, the corridor strobed red. And in the red, filling it wall to wall, a dozen more black frames were coming down the passage in a slow, deliberate line, and behind them the ship's alarms were dying one deck at a time. Looked at the corridor, and then he looked at the 9 of them on the floor, and then he made the only choice a person from ever really makes. He crouched beside her, the bay monitor, can you get it working? She nodded or tried to, pinned under a full G with her lungs still burning. He lifted her the way he would lift a child, one arm under her back, and set her against the control alcove where the cracked screen flickered. Then he pulled the 2 dead frames across the ruined hatch as a barricade, tore the plasma rifle from the second one's grip, and looked back at. Keep them breathing, he said, that's your job now. Stared at him, he could not speak. Stepped over the barricade and into the red. What the 9 cadets saw next, they saw on a broken monitor with a white star spreading across one corner, and none of them would ever describe it the same way, and none of them would ever forget it. They saw the human go into the corridor at a run, small and dark against the strobing red, one figure walking toward 12. Not a sprint, just the steady, ground-eating lope of a thing built to chase prey across open country until the prey lay down and died. The lead raider raised its weapon and was already inside its reach, and the rifle he carried was not for shooting. He swung it like a club and the frame's shoulder joint came apart in a shower of sparks. He caught the second frame under the arm and slammed it into the third. He took a plasma bolt across the left shoulder, a burn that lit his uniform and blackened the skin beneath, and he did not slow. Watched with her hand pressed against her mouth. Behind her, propped against the housing, watched too, and the thing that had been sitting wrong in his chest since the mess deck finally had a name, and the name was shame. The monitor showed the human take a shock baton across the back and turn and break the arm that held it. It showed him dragging 3 instructors unconscious, all 3 of them at once, one under each arm and one across his shoulders, down a smoke-filled passage to a bay. It showed him tearing a jammed pod hatch open with his hands, the alloy screaming, and shoving them inside and slapping the launch key. It showed him turn around and go back into the smoke. Read it, said. Turned, her black eyes were streaming. The file, you had it, read it, all of it. His voice cracked, please. She fumbled the slate out of her tunic. The screen was shattered, but the text still glowed through the fracture. She read in a whisper, and the bay was so quiet that all 9 of them heard every word. Homo Sol III Class 9, sustained gravity tolerance 1.0 G nominal. Native atmosphere 21% oxygen, acutely toxic, endurance index highest recorded among sapient species, persistence predator, documented capacity to sustain pursuit for over 100 kilometers. She swallowed. Unarmed strength ratio baseline 6.4. Pain response, functional under conditions lethal to all other concordant species. Recommendation, do not engage in unarmed contact. She stopped, there was one more paragraph, and she read it slower. Human recruits are to be treated with the same courtesy the Concordant extends to any apex predator, with respect, and never cornered. Nobody said anything. On his back, closed his eyes, one of them made a small sound. The had put his slate face down on the deck. Looked at the monitor. On it, the human had reached the bridge corridor and was fighting his way through the last of the raiders, one broken frame at a time, and every hit he took should have put him down, and none of them did. 11 nights, said to no one. I held its head down for 11 nights. The bridge of the Ashen Vigil was a wreck when reached it, 12 minutes after he had stepped over the barricade. Half the consoles were dark. The captain was slumped against the command rail with a plasma burn through her tunic, conscious with pain, and 4 raiders in frames stood over the surviving crew with weapons leveled. They saw him come through the door with smoke rising off his shoulder and blood on his hands, and something in his face that had stopped being patient a long time ago. He did not run at them, he walked to the environmental console. The lead raider fired, took it in the ribs and kept walking, and the console was built, keyed to hands, and he had spent 11 nights on the mess deck memorizing every system diagram on every wall because a person from a learns their environment first, always, before anything else. He found the gravity master. He turned it to 1.0 and hit the override. The Ashen Vigil groaned as the plates came up on every deck at once. 4 frames built for point 3 dropped to their knees with a chorus of failing servos. 20 more scattered through the ship went down with them. And on the bridge, in the sudden red silence, one human stood upright at a full standard gravity with a plasma burn through his side and looked around at a room full of aliens on the floor and did not smile. He crossed the bridge slowly, stepping over the fallen frames, and knelt beside the captain. "Ma'am," he said, "cadet training decks secured. 9 cadets in the gravity bay need medical, none critical, 3 instructors in 4. He paused. "Permission to sit down." The captain looked up at him for a long moment. "Granted," she said. He sat down, then slowly he lay down, and the deck was cool against his cheek, and for the first time in 12 days he let his hands close. The was very white. Woken it with his side packed in and his shoulder wrapped, and an IV of something warm and blue running into his arm. And the first thing he saw when he turned his head was sitting in the visitor's chair with his long hands folded between his knees. His scalpridge was taped, his left arm was in a brace. He looked, for the first time since had met him, like something that could break. Neither of them said anything for a while. Somewhere down the corridor a medic was laughing, the ordinary sound of a ship deciding it was going to live. "They restored the gravity," said finally, "point 3 ship-wide." "Good. The captain wants to see you when you're cleared, and the assembly, and I think the Sol delegation and every news feed in the Concordant." He stopped. "This recording is everywhere, all of it, the bay, the corridor, the bridge." Closed his eyes and the mess deck. "That too." A long silence. "Why," said, and his voice was not steady, "did you never fight back, not once, 11 nights? You could have ended it the first night, you could have ended me." Was quiet so long that thought he had gone back to sleep. "Because I could have," he said at last, "and where I come from, that's exactly why you don't." Did not understand, could see that. So he told him about a cliff above the Pacific and a house that shook in storms and a brother who had gone into a January sea because he could not stand to watch people drown from the shore. He told him that on Earth everything could kill you and everyone knew it, and the ones who survived were not the ones who hit hardest. They were the ones who learned when not to. "My mother asked me for one thing," he said. "She asked me not to be the reason your people say we're animals, so I knelt. It cost me nothing I couldn't afford." He turned his head and looked at, "It would have cost you everything." Sat with that for a long time. His hands had gone still in his lap and noticed for the first time that they were shaking. Then he stood up awkwardly, favoring the brace, and went to the basin by the door and filled a cup with clean water. He came back and stood beside the bed, and with 9 cadets and 2 medics watching from the corridor, Sub-Cadet, son of the assembly, knelt on the floor and poured the water slowly over his own head and let it run down his face and into his collar and did not wipe it away. The had no ritual for this, he had made one. "Thank you," he said. Looked at him for a moment. Then he reached down, took a towel from the rack and held it out. 3 days later, the Ashen Vigil limped into dock at Concordant Prime, and every training vessel in the fleet received the same transmission in the same clipped voice. "Fleet standing order effective immediately. All cadets, all species, all vessels, read the intake files, all of them, every species, every world, you will not be told again." And on the observation deck, alone, with the stars turning slowly past the glass, Daniel found the small blue-white point of a sun that was still 900 light-years away, and pressed his open hand flat against the viewport, and spoke to a woman on a cliff above the sea. "They didn't call us animals, Mom," he said. "They called us cadets." Behind him, quietly 9 aliens came onto the deck, first with her cracked slate and last with his arm in its brace, and stood in a loose half-circle and did not say anything and did not leave.